Well, hello to my viewers. If you're expecting a Puritan paperback review today, I have to leave you sorely disappointed. Oh, last week I was just busy. Had to write a sermon. I was sick, bedridden, kind of sick, and by God's grace, I managed to preach that sermon with my voice intact. So, for Puritan reading, I will be a little bit behind. Hopefully, I get caught up to that next week. Back on the usual Puritan paperback review. So for this week, I'm going to review an old book, old so to speak, but one book that's had a profound impact on me. So I read this during my university days. Arguably, he is a Puritan. So it is Spiritual Depression, Its Causes and Cures by Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones. Well, I guess the D also stands for David, but that's all besides the point. So Lloyd-Jones, he's considered by many as like the last Puritan, and he's given this sort of comment because his sermons, even though he's been dead for a while, his sermons still speak today. His sermons, even though they're written in the 20th century, if you read them, they almost seem just as relevant, as if they're written just for today's age and culture. So, interestingly about Martyn Lloyd-Jones, he actually never wrote any books. So his books are all his sermons, just compiled. I've read his 2-volume, well, some are here, his 2-volume biography by Ian Murray. And towards the end of his life, he actually started tweaked his sermons a little bit so that they're made readable. So if you listen online, many of his sermons are available for free from Martyn Lloyd-Jones Trust, so MLJ Trust. And if you've never heard him, I do advise taking a listen. He might be a little bit less spectacular than you expect. He is a Welshman, but he just has this confidence in portraying the truth, speaking God's truth as it is, and making it just clear to you. So Lloyd-Jones, he's one of my favorite preachers from just all time. He's almost like the gateway drug towards the Puritans. And here, this was a book that I read in my university days. So I was a young man, a young and spiritually depressed man. And this book helped me a great deal. So Lloyd-Jones, if you don't know much about him, he's Welsh, but he initially did not go into the ministry. So he was trained up in the medical field. He was a doctor. He was actually climbing up the ranks. He was going to be quite a good doctor. And then all of a sudden, he had this calling from the Lord. And he just switched right over. He started to preach. Went into the ministry. So that in itself was interesting. His 2-volume biography was a great read. Long read, but a great read. But maybe to the actual matter, what is this book about? Spiritual depression, its causes and cure. So here I can show you the table of contents. He goes through this series on spiritual depression. He talks, some general considerations, and I don't have time to go into every single chapter, but some of these chapters were just so good. So I'll talk briefly about it later, but there's vain regrets, that one sin, fear of the future. That's probably the big bulk of it. And then looking at the waves, that was another great sermon. God's gymnasium as well. I don't even remember actually about learning to be content, but it just shows how long ago I read this book. It must be about, I want to say, could be 7 or 8 years now actually. So a little while since I've read this book, but he just has so many gems for someone, if you find you're a little bit more emotionally based, you tend to feel more than you think, or you process things with your feelings first. Lloyd-Jones just has so many good reminders. And when I was a younger person, I think I was more of that person who just had strong mood swings, which is very feeling dependent, and then Lloyd-Jones helped balance me out. So, if I could even read you from just his first sermon, when he starts off this whole series on spiritual depression. He has this comments on just the whole idea of spiritual depression, because his main premise is that the Psalms, they do deal with themes of depression. The psalmist, sometimes he is in a depressed state. So how does he deal with it? And here, this is from just his first sermon. He says, "But there is another and more important reason, which is that we must face this problem for the sake of the kingdom of God and for the glory of God." In a sense, a depressed Christian is a contradiction in terms, and he is a very poor recommendation for the gospel. We are living in a pragmatic age. People today are not primarily interested in truth, but they are interested in results. The one question they ask is, does it work? They are frantically seeking and searching for something that can help them. So here, it's not like he's saying that Christians can never, ever be depressed. But in an age that doesn't value truth as much, there's that question right away, right? Is there any good in being a Christian? Every year, mental health rolls around. And this is before even mental health. But I'm saying today, mental health rolls around. And then Christians seem to also fall into this category too of, oh, I too am also depressed. So people, they are bound to ask, right? It's not that can a Christian just never ever be depressed, but, what good is it? What good is it being a Christian if you also are just like the rest of us, the rest of the world? So Lloyd-Jones, he deals with this just even from the start. And I found even just the first chapter was immensely helpful for someone who was depressed, who was just sort of swept around by the waves of his emotions. And he really just focused on Psalm 42. Why are you downcast, O my soul? And that's such an important question to ask for everyone who just seems to have, low views of self. Not that, I'll sort of nuance that. Low views of self and just depressed feelings. Because oftentimes, Lloyd-Jones says that we are too prone to listening to ourselves. We'll hear these comments from within just say, oh, I'm so worthless, I'm a failure, nobody likes me, yada, 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 just all these negative thoughts. And the first thing he says is that you cannot listen to these inward voices. Instead, you must question it, just as how the psalmist in Psalm 42 says, why are you downcast, O my soul? And you ask yourself, why am I downcast? Why am I depressed? What is causing my depression? Because everything has a cause. It can't just be out of nowhere. If it's out of nowhere, then I don't know, it's just like you really can't do anything about it. But the way the world works, there is, a cause and a result. So if you're depressed, there's a cause for it. So there, he's telling Christians, talk to yourself. Why are you depressed? Why are you downcast? And then use the gospel. Basically, the hope that you have, how does it apply to your situation? The gospel, how does that apply to your situation? So that was just the first sermon. And out of the many sermons, he treats it almost like it's his medical background, right? The causes. What are the causes of spiritual depression? Now, how do you cure it? That's very Puritan-like as well. And I think he does have some very good ones. There's Vain Regrets. That chapter was very good because many people are prone to just living in the past. They're just bogged down by, oh, I've made this mistake in the past. I've sinned this in the past. And with all things in the past, you can't change it. And that'll just cause you turmoil, right? If you just dwell on it, oh, why did I do that? And you think about, what can I do to fix it? And there's nothing. You just have to let it go because it's in the past, right? Maybe you suffered the consequences for it, but what's done is done. You can't fix it. So Vain Regrets, If you've done something that you regret from the past, you just have to leave it there. And then another one is fear of the future. So if you don't just have this fear of the future, or sorry, vain regret, then what's your attitude towards the future? Are you living in the future? And the future for many is always scary because you just don't know what's going to happen, right? God, he's sovereign over all things, but us humans, we're a little bit short-sighted. We can see, what's happening today. We can maybe plan for the week. We can try to make plans for the upcoming months. But ultimately, if those plans fall apart, there's this fear of, what's next? What am I going to do? Will God provide for my needs? So, the past, the future, those are two big things. Feelings as well. This is one that Lloyd-Jones really emphasizes, and I think is very needed in today's culture too. We are very prone to just, whatever I feel is truth. That's like a sentiment. If I feel bad, the world is bad. But again, that's not true, because there's many reasons why you can feel bad. There's many reasons why you can feel great as well. And oftentimes it's dependent on circumstances. If you wake up feeling bad, there's usually a cause. Maybe something bad happened the night before. Maybe there's something bad that you don't want to do today. Or whatever else. There's usually a cause again. So again, feelings, he says not to trust your feelings too much, but instead you have to live by the truth. Remind yourself of the truth. And then looking at the waves, that was another great sermon. Now on, it's, the disciples are out there in the storm. Jesus, he's just walking on the waves. And then Peter, he bids, Lord, if it's you, bid me to walk on the water. And then Jesus says, come. So Peter, he also starts to walk on the water. But then in the Gospel of Matthew, it gives that little narrative like, he was looking at Jesus, but the waves and the wind are very great. So Peter, of course, he takes his eyes off Jesus and looks at the waves, and then he starts to sink. And there it's, what are you looking at? Are you looking at Christ? Or are you looking at the waves and the wind of life? So that sermon too was such a good one, because I think oftentimes it's so easy to lose sight of Jesus. It's easy to think, I've started looking at Jesus, I start to walk a bit on the water, and then, now I've realized, God calling me to do this thing. Jesus bidding Peter to walk on the water. It's actually much harder than I thought. And then as Peter experiences that difficulty, then he sinks because he's looking at the wind and the waves. Same with us. We look at the difficulties and we sink too. So those are some of just the key points of what I remember from a while ago. Let's look at the chapters. I do recognize some of them. I do remember enjoying them quite a bit. One of the most notable stories I do remember from this book was, it might be from the 5th chapter, that one sin. It deals with the past as well. It's a story that's often repeated everywhere, because it's just such a memorable story. But he was counseling this, I don't know if you can call him a veteran or submariner, but this guy, he would have headaches, and there just was no discernible cause at least at the time, for why he had these headaches. He went to several doctors and they couldn't find out why. So he comes to Lloyd-Jones, and Lloyd-Jones counsels him, and he finds out that, this man, he used to serve in, I believe it was World War II. He tells this story about how he's in a war, he's in a submarine, at this fight, and then I think, a torpedo must have hit his submarine and just went to the bottom of the sea. And then Lloyd-Jones, asks him, and then so what? And the man just has nothing else to say. He's like, and then he just sort of tells the story again, he went through the war, the submarine got hit, and it was just at the bottom of the sea. And what you find is that this man was just living in the bottom of the sea. He never got past that moment of, his ship must have gotten up somehow, because he's not at the bottom of the sea anymore. But because he was living in the past, he was just getting those headaches. So Lloyd-Jones has to really press him, and so what? And so what? And finally, he sort of gets him to come to his senses that he's no longer at the bottom of the sea. He's no longer in that submarine, but he's here in the present. He's no longer just living in the past. And it's a similar vein to like vain regret. It's just this defeat from the past that you've just never moved on from. So this book, it helps me immensely. I was sort of working through it just slowly in my university days. I do remember it was like a summer. I was commuting to quite a far downtown church because if I think about the commute now, it must have been like maybe like an hour and a half or 2 hour commute one way, just to church on Sunday. Wild times when you're young. I do remember that, as I was sort of reading, I had time to read because I took like a bus downtown and then took the subway. So I had time on the bus to read a chapter a week. And every chapter I just felt a little less depressed as I read this book. Every week, Lloyd-Jones, his sermons from the past, administered some goodness and truth to my soul. So if you are spiritually depressed, work through this book slowly. I've told many people in the past, even if you just read the first chapter, I think that was already such a big help. Just not listening to yourself, and instead you have to ask yourself, why are you downcast, oh my soul? And then the harder part is really just applying that. So sometimes when your mind just spirals down, you have to catch yourself and be like, wait, why am I feeling this way? Why am I feeling downcast? So as you sort of get better at catching yourself in these sort of spirals, you spiral less, you catch it sooner, you're able to minister truth to yourself better, and really to preach that truth to yourself. Because I agree, right? If someone's a little bit depressed, and then they're already moping a bit, and then you tell them, okay, you gotta preach truth to yourself, and you're just like, Jesus died for my sins, and then it's like, well, nothing's changed. But really, they have to sort of make that truth just felt by their hearts, felt in their situation. So, maybe I feel worthless today, or I feel like forgotten. Well, what does the gospel have to say? If I feel forgotten today, then what do I think about? What do I know about what the Bible has to say about God and His people? Well, God, He remembers His people. Sometimes His people have to call on God to remember them, but God, He never forgets His promises. And as a Heavenly Father, He will not forget those who He sent His Son Jesus Christ to die for. So even if like a nursing mother could forget her child, right? It's almost unthinkable. Could God forget you? Could Jesus forget you if He died for you? If He took the nails on His hands? If He's engraved you on His hands? Could He forget you? And you just wonder, like, well, there's no way then, right? It's like, Jesus, He still bears those scars today. He's shown such a great love. I am not forgotten. So there's many ways, right? And as you walk through valleys of the shadow of death, you just get better and better at applying, gospel truth to each and every one of your situations. And of course, that takes working through the Bible. That takes some spiritual discipline. So he does talk about that. So, otherwise, Lloyd-Jones, I've read quite a lot of his material. Like, that was me before the Puritans. Now that I have the Puritans, I do enjoy them quite a bit. But Lloyd-Jones, I think he is a little bit more accessible because he was just from the 20th century. So a lot of his writing, he's not using like crazy language like the Puritans. He's not going crazy technical either, because these are all sermons that have been tweaked so that they're easier to read. So this is actually quite a good book, very practical for many in our day and age, and still very relevant. Like even just that first section I read, in a culture that just does not value truth and just thinks more about practicality, right? What does Christianity have to offer to me? Does it work? And Lloyd-Jones, he would say, he wouldn't just like try to market Christianity just to be practical, but he does say that when the church is different, then it invariably attracts the world. When a church stops looking like the world and instead follows God's commands, and they have the joy of knowing God, the joy of salvation, the world just can't help but be attracted to the church. And that in itself is a good way for gospel witness. So, if only all Christians could be joyful, right? Joyful in every situation, able to combat depression, spiritual downcastness. Not that you never can be, but you have the tools. If you have God, you know that there's a cause for your depression. There's a way to overcome it. So that's a little casual book review, just based off of memory. Didn't really look too much at these sermons, but this one is always such a good book and one I've recommended to many. So I hope it's helpful, and see you in the next video.